In the dust-choked town of Deadwood Springs, a small saloon known as the Black Coyote draws in weary travelers and wayward men. It's a place where whiskey flows and dangerous deals are made. But when a group of ruthless thugs corner a beautiful saloon girl, they unknowingly pick the wrong target. Little do they know, this woman is the most feared gunslinger in the West. Her past is cloaked in bloodshed and vengeance, and this encounter would change the criminal empire of Deadwood Springs forever. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. The sun had already begun to sink behind the distant hills, casting long, crooked shadows across Deadwood Springs. It was a small, dusty town, hardly more than a speck on the map, but it had a reputation that attracted folks from all corners of the West. Some came for a fresh start, some for a good drink, and some for darker, more sinister reasons. The Black Coyote Saloon was the heart of it all. From the outside, it didn't look like much, just a wooden building with a rickety sign hanging above the door. But inside, it was a different world. The smell of cigar smoke, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of low conversation filled the air. It was the kind of place where men could escape their troubles for a while, or start new ones. At the bar, a man named Jake McGraw nursed his whiskey, eyes scanning the room with a practiced wariness. He was one of the town's most notorious figures, a man whose reputation stretched all the way from the borderlands to Denver. His gang, the Devil's Hand, had been operating in Deadwood Springs for years, running a network of gambling halls, crooked businesses, and illicit trade. If you crossed them, you didn't last long. But tonight, Jake's mind wasn't on business. He was distracted, watching the woman on the stage with a hungry eye. Her name was Lila Lil Byrne, and she was the Black Coyote star performer. A saloon girl, yes, but she was known for something else. A deadly, silent skill that the toughest of men could never fully understand. Lil was a striking figure, her dark eyes shadowed under a cascade of black hair that tumbled down her shoulders like midnight. Her dress clung to her curves in all the right places, but it was her smile, the kind that could break a man's heart, that kept them coming back. Jake had heard whispers, the kind of rumors that ran through town like wildfire. Some said Lil was a former outlaw, others that she had a bounty on her head. He didn't care much for rumors, but he did care for power, and he knew she had it, though in a different way than he was used to. Lil's voice rang out across the saloon as she sang softly, her lips curving into a smile. Her words were a lullaby, sweet and dangerous. The room fell silent, everyone listening, almost hypnotized by her voice. But as the music played, a new group of men entered the saloon, their spurs clinking against the wooden floorboards. They were rough types, grimy faces, calloused hands, and eyes that hadn't seen anything but violence for years. Jake recognized them instantly as part of a rival gang, the Black Fong Riders. The leader, a man named Willard Black Snake Hayes, was as vicious as they came. He was a big man, with a scar running down the side of his face that looked like it had been made by a knife. His gang had been trying to muscle in on Deadwood Springs for some time now, pushing their way into McGraw's territory. As Hayes and his men approached the bar, their eyes flickered toward Lil on the stage, like sharks circling their prey. It wasn't long before one of them, a wiry man named Hank, started toward her, a leer spreading across his face. "Hey, sweetheart," Hank called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the music. "Why don't you come over here and show us what you're made of?" Jake watched as the other men in the saloon looked up, most of them taking a step back. They knew better than to get involved with the Black Fong Riders, but they weren't about to stand up to them either. Lil's expression didn't change. She kept singing, her eyes never leaving the crowd, but a flicker of tension ran through her, barely noticeable, but there. Hank stepped up to the stage, leaning against the wooden railing, his eyes locked on her. "I'm talking to you, darlin'," he growled, now only a few feet from her. His hand reached out, trying to grab her arm. That was when everything changed. Without a single movement, Lil's hand shot out faster than a rattlesnake strike. She grabbed Hank's wrist, twisting it with such force that his bone cracked audibly. He let out a scream, but before he could even think of drawing a weapon, Lil was already standing before him. Jake's eyes narrowed as he watched her move. That was no ordinary saloon girl. She wasn't just a pretty face and a sweet voice. Lil had something else, something that sent a shiver down his spine. "Get your hands off me, or I'll make sure you don't have them anymore," Lil said, her voice cold, yet laced with a warning. Hank's face turned white, and for a moment, it seemed like he might listen. But Black Snake Hayes wasn't the type to back down. He stepped forward, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. "What the hell do you think you're doing, lady?" he growled, aiming the gun directly at her. The whole room held its breath, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. But Lil didn't flinch. Her eyes locked onto Hayes, her hand still holding Hank's broken wrist. The sound of her boots hitting the wooden floor was the only thing that broke the silence as she moved. Faster than anyone could follow, her hand reached for the derringer hidden beneath her skirt. In one swift motion, she drew it, aimed it directly at Hayes, and fired. The gunshot rang out through the saloon, loud and sharp. Hayes dropped to the floor before he even had time to react, a single bullet hole in his chest. The saloon erupted in chaos as Hank scrambled to get away, and the rest of the Black Fong riders reached for their guns. But Lil was already moving again, her hands as fast as lightning. Jake watched in disbelief as she dispatched them one by one, her movements fluid and graceful. It was as if the saloon had become her personal stage, the men around her nothing but targets. When it was over, the saloon was eerily silent. Jake's pulse raced as he looked at the lifeless bodies of the Black Fong riders. Then his gaze turned to Lil, standing at the center of the room, the scent of gunpowder lingering in the air. The woman everyone had underestimated, the woman they had thought of as nothing more than a saloon girl, had just brought Deadwood Springs to its knees. The room remained frozen for a heartbeat, the acrid smell of gunpowder still thick in the air. The dead bodies of the Black Fong riders lay scattered around the saloon like discarded dolls. Their weapons had fallen from their hands, some still within reach, but no one dared to move. Not even the toughest of Deadwood Springs residents could fathom what they had just witnessed. Lil Byrne, standing at the center of it all, was like a calm in the eye of a storm. Her hand remained steady as she lowered her derringer, the cold steel of the barrel gleaming in the low light. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, swept across the room, meeting the gaze of each person in turn. Jake McGraw's pulse still thundered in his chest. He'd seen a lot in his time. Plenty of bloodshed, plenty of violence. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight. It was a masterclass in execution. He could almost feel the weight of her gaze as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. He could have sworn there was a moment, just a fleeting moment, where her eyes locked on his, and she saw straight through him. And for a moment, the saloon was silent. The patrons, who had once been so eager to drink and gamble, now found themselves lost in the aftermath of what had just unfolded before them. No one spoke a word. Jake couldn't help but break the stillness. He leaned back against the bar, his eyes narrowing as he took in the destruction around him. He could feel the stir of something unsettling deep inside his gut, something he hadn't felt in years: fear. "Who the hell are you, lady?" Jake's voice broke the silence, his tone steady but laced with an edge of confusion and awe. Lil's lips curled into a slight smile, but it wasn't a smile of warmth or charm. It was a knowing smile, as though she understood the full extent of what had just transpired. Slowly, she wiped the blood from her hands onto her skirt, never taking her eyes off Jake. "You're not from here, are you, Jake McGraw?" she asked, her voice low but commanding. "I've heard about you, heard the stories. The big bad outlaw who controls this town. But what I don't understand is why you let trash like Hayes run around like they own the place." Jake straightened, a mix of anger and admiration stirring inside him. He didn't take kindly to anyone questioning his authority in Deadwood Springs. He was the law here. He didn't answer to anyone. "I run this town, sweetheart," Jake said, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "And I don't take kindly to threats." But Lil wasn't fazed. If anything, she seemed almost amused. "You misunderstand," she replied, her voice laced with calm finality. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to end things." Jake narrowed his eyes. Was she challenging him? Was she making a play for his territory? He couldn't tell, but something about her, Something about the way she held herself told him she wasn't just some woman looking to make a name for herself. The way she had taken down Hayes and his men, that wasn't just gunplay. That was precision. "You think you can just walk in here, clean up the mess, and walk away?" Jake said with a low laugh. "You're either brave or stupid, lady. Or both." Lil didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to the bartender, who had been standing frozen behind the counter since the gunfire. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he stared at the blood-stained floor. "Clean it up," she said simply, her eyes still fixed on Jake. The bartender hesitated for a moment, clearly still in shock, but something in Lil's gaze seemed to break him from his trance. He nodded quickly and scrambled to gather the broken bodies of the Black Fong riders, his hands trembling as he dragged them away. Meanwhile, the saloon's patrons started to murmur, the buzz of conversation picking up again, albeit in hushed tones. Everyone seemed to be trying to process the chaos, but Jake could feel the shift. The dynamic in the room had changed, and he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. "You've made your point," Jake said after a long pause, his hand still resting on his revolver. "But don't think for a second that I'm going to bow down to you." Lil stepped down from the stage, her boots clicking softly against the wood. As she passed Jake, she stopped for a moment, standing close enough for him to feel her presence, her calm, controlled presence. There was no fear in her eyes, no sign of hesitation. "I'm not asking you to bow down, Jake," she said, her voice smooth, but carrying an underlying threat. "I'm here to take what's mine." Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. What did she mean by that? Before he could ask, Lil's gaze shifted to the back door of the saloon, where a few of the town's more troublesome figures had slipped out into the night. "Jake's gang. The Devil's Hand. I'd be careful who you trust around here if I were you," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. Things are about to get real interesting in Deadwood Springs. The saloon grew quieter again, as if everyone was holding their breath. They all knew that the power in the town was about to shift, but no one could predict how. Jake watched as Lil walked out the door, her figure vanishing into the twilight, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty. Her actions had spoken louder than any words, and now, Deadwood Springs would never be the same again. The evening air in Deadwood Springs was thick with the smell of dust and decay. As the last light of day slipped over the horizon, the town seemed to exhale a collective breath. The Black Coyote Saloon, once filled with laughter and music, now stood in eerie silence. The men who had once filled its chairs were either dead or too afraid to speak. Jake McGraw stood alone at the bar, his fingers resting on his glass of whiskey, staring at the empty spot where Lil had stood moments before. His mind raced. What was she? Who was she? Lil had just obliterated his biggest rival with nothing but a flick of her wrist, and yet she was no ordinary gunslinger. He'd seen his fair share of hardened criminals, but this woman? She was different. Every movement, every decision, seemed deliberate, like she knew exactly how the game was going to unfold. Jake downed the last of his whiskey in a single gulp, the burn in his throat doing little to calm his nerves. He had an empire to protect, and something in the back of his mind told him that Lil wasn't going to stop until she had everything. He'd heard whispers, of course, rumors that ran through the saloon like wildfire, murmurs about a woman who was once a part of a gang that had terrorized the West. The most feared gunslinger in the land, they said. But that was all they were, rumors. Now, standing in the cold emptiness of the saloon, Jake wasn't so sure. Out on the dusty streets, the town of Deadwood Springs seemed oddly peaceful. The wind blew through the buildings, kicking up a swirl of dirt that danced across the road. The people had scattered after the chaos in the saloon, unsure of what to make of the night's events. But for all the silence, the undercurrent of fear was palpable. They didn't know what was coming, but they knew it wasn't going to be good. Lil Byrne had walked through that saloon with the kind of confidence that could break men. She hadn't even flinched when the guns were drawn. Her calm, measured steps had spoken volumes to anyone who had been paying attention. This wasn't some random act of violence. It was a calculated move, a message sent to those who thought they could control the town. She was here to take something, and she wouldn't stop until it was hers. Back at the Devil's Hand's hideout, the tension was high. Jake's men had returned to their hideout on the outskirts of town, and the leader was pacing back and forth, his mind buzzing. That woman. She's something else. One of Jake's right-hand men, Sam, said, his voice low. I've never seen anything like it. You think she's just some woman who came in here looking for a fight? Jake snapped, his fists clenched. No, this isn't some random thing. She's here for a reason. She wants power. She wants control. And we can't let her have it. Sam didn't argue. He knew Jake wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. But there was something in Jake's voice, a hint of uncertainty, that gave him pause. Are you sure we can take her down, boss? Sam asked, hesitant. She's not like anyone we've faced before. Jake slammed his fist on the table, the wood creaking under the pressure. We'll take her down, all right. But first, we need to find out who she really is. Back at the saloon, the bartender had finally begun cleaning up the mess left behind by the Black Fong riders. His hands were shaking as he swept the blood-stained floor, trying his best to keep the contents of his stomach from rising to his throat. But the night was far from over, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was brewing in Deadwood Springs. As he mopped the floor, he glanced toward the back door, where Lil had exited. He had been around long enough to know when a storm was coming. The way she had handled those men, it was something he hadn't seen in years. And yet, there was a part of him that wondered if she was really here to fix things, or if she was just another player in a much larger game. The door swung open again, and Lil stepped back inside, her silhouette outlined by the dim light of the street lamp outside. The bartender straightened up, his heart racing as she approached. You didn't have to come back, he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and fear. Lil's eyes met his, calm and steady. I didn't come back for you, she replied, her tone cool but not unkind. I came back because I'm not finished yet. The bartender swallowed hard, unsure whether to ask more or stay silent. Finished with what? Lil's gaze swept the room, as if considering something. This town, it's got too many people trying to pull the strings. And I'm not the kind of person who sits back and lets things happen. Not anymore. For a moment, the bartender just stood there, unsure of what to say. But the answer was clear, and the weight of it settled heavily in the pit of his stomach. Lil wasn't here to make peace. She wasn't even here to survive. She was here to take over, to break the back of the criminal empire that had corrupted Deadwood Springs for so long. And from the way she looked at him, it seemed like she was only getting started. Jake McGraw sat alone in his office, his chair creaking as he leaned back and thought about the choices ahead. The Devil's Hand had been in Deadwood Springs for years, their grip on the town like a vice. No one had dared to challenge them, not until now. Lil Byrne was an enigma, a woman with a deadly skill and a mysterious past. Jake's instincts told him she wasn't just playing at this. She had come for something bigger than what Deadwood Springs could offer. All right, Lil, Jake muttered to himself, his fingers tracing the outline of his revolver. If you want control, you'll have to take it from me. Jake had been in this game too long to back down now. He wasn't about to let some woman with a fancy gun and a silver tongue take what was his. He reached for the whiskey bottle on the desk, pouring himself another drink. If the Black Fong riders weren't going to do the job, he'd have to find someone who would. The battle for Deadwood Springs had just begun. The air around Deadwood Springs seemed to hum with the promise of conflict. For days after the Black Fong riders were wiped out, nothing seemed to settle. People walked the dusty streets with hurried steps, their heads down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might have answers. Lil's actions had shaken the very core of the town's criminal underbelly, and there was no going back. Something had broken, and Deadwood Springs was on the cusp of something far worse than what anyone could have anticipated. Jake McGraw hadn't slept in days. His mind churned with thoughts of Lil Byrne, her precise, deliberate movements, the way she'd taken down Hayes and his men without breaking a sweat. It was as if she were untouchable, and that terrified him. He had to act fast. If he let her take control, if he allowed her to dismantle the empire he had built, there was no telling what would happen to him. Jake had enemies, but he was the one with power, the one who called the shots in Deadwood Springs. That was until she showed up. Tonight, he sat in the back room of the Black Coyote Saloon, surrounded by the remnants of his gang. What little was left after the Black Fong riders had been wiped off the map. Most of the men were still licking their wounds, unsure of how to move forward. But Jake wasn't about to let them wallow in defeat. There was one thing left to do: eliminate the threat, no matter the cost. Lil, meanwhile, had been keeping to herself since the bloodbath at the saloon. She didn't trust anyone in town, not after what she had seen. She'd heard the whispers, seen the fear in people's eyes, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Jake McGraw would come after her. Her past had taught her the value of patience. She wasn't in any rush, but she knew what she had to do. Deadwood Springs wasn't just any town. It was the center of Jake's criminal empire, and if she was going to take him down, she needed to bring it all to a halt. She wasn't just going to dismantle his operations. She was going to crush his reputation, his authority, until there was nothing left but rubble. Tonight, however, she wasn't alone. She sat at the bar in the Black Coyote once again, her dark eyes scanning the room. Her fingers absent-mindedly twirled a piece of whiskey-soaked cloth as she surveyed the crowd. The bartender had been quiet since her return, but his anxiety was palpable. "I'm not here for you," Lil said, sensing the man's discomfort. The bartender barely met her gaze. "You got what you wanted. You killed them all. What more do you want?" Lil's lips curved into a tight smile. "This town isn't done with me yet," she replied cryptically. "But I'll make sure that when the dust settles, it won't be McGraw who's standing at the top." The man swallowed hard, nodding, but his eyes never left her. Jake McGraw's plan was simple: hit her where it hurt. He wasn't going to face her directly, not yet. Instead, he sent his remaining men to start working in the shadows, striking at anyone who might be an ally of hers, or even just someone who looked like they could provide information. The message was clear: if you aligned yourself with Lil Byrne, you would pay the price. The violence came swiftly. Late that night, a young man who had been seen talking to Lil earlier was dragged from his home and beaten within an inch of his life. The town's few allies of hers were similarly threatened, their businesses sabotaged, their families terrified. Jake was playing a dangerous game. He knew it would draw attention, and that was exactly the point. If Lil was watching, she'd have no choice but to make her move. The next morning, the town was alive with whispers. It wasn't just the typical chatter of saloon-goers, but something darker, something that gnawed at the very soul of Deadwood Springs. People were starting to realize that the criminals who once ran the town with relative subtlety had been exposed. They were on the defensive, retreating into the shadows where they belonged. Lil didn't care. The damage had already been done. She had spent the night in the old livery stable, the place she had called home during her early days as an outlaw. She had grown accustomed to the smell of hay, the creaking of the old wooden beams. It had once been a place of comfort, a place to lay low. Now, it was a base of operations for something far bigger. She pulled her boots on slowly, methodically, her eyes scanning the room. It wasn't about the revenge anymore. It wasn't just about killing Jake McGraw. It was about something deeper, something far more profound. She needed control. Deadwood Springs had been Jake's kingdom for too long, and the time for change had come. It was as much about sending a message to the other outlaws of the West as it was about taking down McGraw. No more would towns like this be ruled by greed and corruption. The West had seen too much of it already. As she mounted her horse, Lil felt the weight of her decision settle heavily in her chest. She wasn't going back to the Black Coyote this time. There was no need for theatrics. It was time to finish this. Jake McGraw would have to answer for everything. Every life he had ruined, every deal he had made under the table, every soul he had destroyed in the pursuit of power. The town wasn't big, but it didn't matter. Deadwood Springs was Jake's kingdom, but it would soon be hers. Jake sat in his office, his fingers tightening around his revolver. He had known the backlash would come, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to handle it. His gang was fractured, and Lil Byrne wasn't going to let up. Suddenly, the door to his office swung open, and in stepped Sam, his face a mask of worry. "It's happening, boss," Sam said breathlessly. "The town's starting to turn. People are getting nervous. Lil's men, they're moving in." Jake stood abruptly, his hand hovering near his revolver. "I knew it. Damn it. We don't have time to wait any longer." He stormed toward the window, looking out over Deadwood Springs, the town he had spent years building, the town that was about to crumble beneath him. A distant shot rang out in the distance. One single, solitary shot. Lil was sending a message, and it wasn't one Jake could ignore. The single shot echoed through the stillness of Deadwood Springs, its sharp crack cutting through the morning air like a warning bell. It wasn't just the sound of a gunshot. It was the sound of change. It reverberated through the dust-choked streets, rolling over the rooftops and rattling the windows of every saloon, shack, and cabin in the town. Jake McGraw's hand rested on the window frame, his knuckles white as he stared into the distance, his heart racing. He knew that sound. That was no random shot fired into the air. Lil was making her move, and she wasn't about to let anyone stand in her way. Sam's voice broke through the tension. "What do we do, boss?" "It's happening. The whole damn town is shifting. You know what she wants." Jake turned away from the window, his gaze dark and steely. He didn't have time to hesitate. He was a man used to controlling situations, used to making decisions quickly. But this was different. Lil wasn't like anyone he'd ever faced before. "We fight back," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "We gather everyone we can. We put the fear back in these people before it's too late. If she thinks she can just walk in here and take what's ours, she's got another thing coming." But inside, Jake wasn't as certain as his words suggested. The fear in the town was palpable. He could feel it, smell it in the air. And it wasn't just the locals who were afraid. It was his own men. Even Sam, his most loyal follower, was showing cracks in his confidence. It was clear that Lil had already planted the seed of doubt in Deadwood Springs. No longer were people willing to turn a blind eye to the corruption that had ruled them. No longer were they willing to let Jake McGraw dictate their fates. And that was something he hadn't anticipated, at least not so soon. Lil had not been idle since the shot rang out. She had ridden through the outskirts of town, her heart pounding with purpose. She didn't need an army. She didn't need 1,000 men to back her up. She only needed one thing: control. It had taken years to build the reputation she now carried with her, the one that was both a curse and a weapon. She had learned long ago that when people underestimated you, it was always the best time to strike. As she moved through the town, her eyes never left the horizon. She wasn't just hunting down Jake McGraw, she was hunting for something much deeper. The cracks in Deadwood Springs were already showing. Her shot wasn't meant to kill anyone. It was meant to send a message. The battle lines had been drawn, and anyone who stood with Jake McGraw would soon realize they'd chosen the losing side. The town was ripe for the taking. Her horse's hooves clicked against the hard-packed earth, each step taking her closer to the center of town, closer to the Black Coyote Saloon, and closer to McGraw's hideout. But Lil wasn't in a rush. She had waited for this moment too long, and now she was going to savor it. Back at McGraw's office, things were unraveling quickly. The first few signs of panic were already creeping in. Whispers of Lil's men, her followers, the ones who had slipped into town quietly and unseen, were spreading like wildfire. They were taking over key positions in Deadwood Springs, quietly infiltrating the heart of the town. The Devil's Hand had been too reckless for too long. They had grown fat on power, operating with little regard for the people who lived in the shadows of their empire. And now, those same people were rising up, no longer content to be pawns in a game that had destroyed their lives. Sam slammed his fist on the table. "Boss, this can't keep going like this. People are scared, and our own men are starting to leave. If we don't do something now, it's over." Jake's jaw tightened. He had never been one to back down, but even he could feel the tides turning. The grip he had on the town was slipping, and Lil Byrne was the one with her fingers wrapped tightly around the neck of Deadwood Springs. "We need to put her down," Jake said, his voice a growl. "Take out anyone who's working with her. We've got enough muscle to make her regret ever setting foot in this town." But even as Jake said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. Lil had already won, in ways Jake couldn't even begin to understand. The town had turned, and the people were no longer following him. They were following her. Outside, Lil rode into the heart of Deadwood Springs, her horse's hooves echoing off the wooden sidewalks. People stopped what they were doing, eyes widening as she passed, recognizing the gunfighter they had heard so much about. The saloon doors creaked open, and a few heads turned as Lil entered, her presence as commanding as ever. The bartender looked up from his duties, his face pale, but his eyes never leaving her as she approached the bar. "You keep coming back," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "But what do you really want?" Lil's eyes met his, dark and steady. "I want what's mine, and I want McGraw to know that I'm not going anywhere." As she spoke, the saloon seemed to grow still. The noise from the outside world faded into a soft murmur, and for the first time, people began to realize that Lil Byrne wasn't just some wandering outlaw. She wasn't some hired gun. She was the storm that would wipe everything away. "You're not afraid of him?" the bartender asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. Lil chuckled softly, leaning in. "No," she said. "I'm not afraid of anyone." She stood, her hand brushing the gun belt at her side, the weight of the weapon heavy with the knowledge of what she had done and what she still had to do. The saloon doors swung open again, and Jake McGraw's voice cut through the tension in the room. "You think you're just going to walk in here and take my town, Lil?" Jake's voice was low, dangerous, but there was a hint of desperation beneath the anger. Lil turned to face him, a calm smile playing at the edges of her lips. "It's not your town anymore, Jake," she said softly. "It never was." Jake's hand hovered over his revolver, but Lil's eyes never wavered. She knew the game, knew the rules, and this time, she was going to break every one of them. The tension in the Black Coyote saloon was palpable. Jake McGraw stood at the threshold, his eyes locked on Lil as if willing her to move, to make a mistake, to give him an opening. But Lil Byrne stood motionless, the very picture of calm. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of her holster, the subtle movement betraying the silent war brewing just beneath the surface. The few remaining patrons of the saloon sensed the shift, the air growing thick with impending violence. Eyes darted back and forth, but no one spoke. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. "Move aside, boy," Jake growled, his voice low and guttural. "I've got business with this woman." The bartender didn't flinch. He knew better than to get in between the two of them. He simply stepped back, hands raised, and let Jake approach Lil. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound in the room was the shuffle of dust beneath boots, and then Jake finally spoke. "You don't belong here," Jake said, his voice full of venom. "Deadwood Springs is mine. It always has been. You think you can just waltz in here and take it from me? You're wrong." Lil's lips curved upward, but the smile wasn't one of amusement. It was something colder, darker, as if she had already heard this speech 1,000 times. "You don't get it, do you, Jake?" Lil replied, her voice steady, almost soft. "This town was never yours to begin with. You built your empire on blood and broken promises. It was only a matter of time before someone came to take it back." Jake's hand twitched, the desire to draw his gun becoming overwhelming, but he hesitated. He knew better than to rush things with a woman like Lil Byrne. She was no ordinary gunslinger. She was a force of nature, and with every word she spoke, with every movement she made, Jake could feel the balance of power shifting more and more in her favor. "You think the people of this town want you?" Jake scoffed, his tone growing more furious. "They're just scared of you. You think they'll follow you? You'll be dead before you ever get the chance to make your move." Lil's eyes flashed, a brief, dangerous glint that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. "Fear doesn't last, Jake," she said calmly, her words piercing the tension in the room. "You can rule through fear for only so long, but eventually, people get tired. Eventually, they stop listening to the man with the gun and start looking for someone who knows how to give them something more." Jake's jaw clenched, and his eyes darted to the men standing in the doorway behind him, his last line of defense. They were armed and ready, but they were beginning to hesitate as well. He could see it in their eyes, the doubt creeping in. It was as if Lil had already won, simply by showing up. "You don't have the guts to pull that trigger, do you?" Lil said, sensing his hesitation. "You're all talk, Jake. All smoke and mirrors." Jake's face reddened in fury, and without warning, his hand shot down to his side, grabbing his revolver. But in the blink of an eye, Lil's hand was faster. The sound of a gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, and before anyone could even react, Jake McGraw collapsed to the ground, his hand still gripping his weapon, but his life already fading. The room fell into stunned silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Jake McGraw was dead. Lil stood over him, the faintest trace of a frown on her lips. The shot hadn't been fatal at first. She'd aimed for his shoulder, intending to disable him and send a message. But when the bullet had struck, he had dropped to the floor with a guttural cry, the force of it sending him into a crumpled heap. She hadn't killed him outright, but the wound would have been enough to end him. The blood soaked through his shirt, and he groaned in pain, his hand twitching as if he was still trying to fight back. Lil took a step closer, her voice low and unwavering. "Jake McGraw," she said softly, "this town isn't yours anymore. You had your chance. And now, you'll see what happens when someone like me decides it's time for a change." Jake coughed, a gurgle of blood escaping from his lips, but he managed to look up at her, his eyes full of hatred. His breath was shallow, and the room seemed to spin as he lay on the floor, unable to lift a finger. "Damn you," he muttered, his voice weak but defiant. "You won't win." Lil knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. "I already have." With that, she stood up and turned her back on him. The room remained frozen, the sound of Jake's gasping breaths the only thing filling the space. But as she stepped away, Lil's eyes swept the saloon. She could feel the change settling into the very air. Something had shifted. The tables were turning, and Jake McGraw was no longer the man in control. Now, it was her turn to dictate the rules. Without a word, Lil walked toward the door. Her boots made no sound as she stepped into the street, the door swinging closed behind her with a soft creak. But the people of Deadwood Springs had seen enough. They had witnessed the end of an era and the beginning of something new. Lil Byrne was no longer just a name. She was a legend. Back inside the saloon, the men who had once followed Jake McGraw were left in stunned silence. They didn't know what to do. The air hung thick with uncertainty, and the weight of their loyalty was heavier than ever. "Anyone else want to stand in my way?" Lil's voice drifted back through the open door, her presence unmistakable. No one answered. No one moved. The saloon was hers now. The streets of Deadwood Springs felt different now. The dusty town, always plagued by the stench of whiskey and blood, seemed somehow quieter, more subdued, as though the very earth itself was holding its breath. The death of Jake McGraw had sent shockwaves through the town. Word spread fast, as it always did in places like this. By sunrise, everyone knew. The tyrant was dead, and Lil Byrne was in control. In the Black Coyote saloon, the tension hadn't yet broken. The men who had once followed McGraw now found themselves without a leader, lost and unsure of where to turn. They sat at the bar, heads down, nursing their drinks in a heavy silence. No one spoke, not yet. There was too much at stake, too much uncertainty about the future. Lil sat at a corner table, her back to the wall, eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been on the move her entire life. The silence around her felt unnatural. She could feel it in her bones. The air was thick with the unspoken question hanging in the room. What now? It was clear to her. She had taken the first step, but the town wasn't going to change overnight. McGraw's men weren't going to fall into line just because their boss was dead. It was going to take more than a few shots and a quick strike to bring about real change. She had made a mark, but the real battle was yet to come. A tall man walked into the saloon, his boots thudding against the wood as he approached the bar. He looked familiar, a face she'd seen around town, but he was no friend of McGraw's. His name was Cole, a former bounty hunter, and while he wasn't a part of McGraw's gang, he had made his living working with him, taking on jobs for the Devil's Hand when they needed an extra hand. He wasn't someone Lil trusted, but right now, she needed all the allies she could get. Cole's eyes flicked over to Lil, and he stopped in his tracks. His hand rested on the brim of his hat, tipping it in a half salute. "I heard the news," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. "Jake's gone." "Huh? And now it's your town?" Lil's gaze never wavered. She kept her expression neutral, weighing his words carefully. This town was never his. "It's mine now." Cole raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a half smile. "Well, that's one way to do it." She nodded slightly. "What do you want?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to see where things stand. Deadwood Springs has been run by McGraw's people for a long time, but I'm guessing that's changing now. I want to know if you're going to keep this place standing, or if you're planning on burning it to the ground." Lil took a moment before answering. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty that came from living under someone else's rule for so long. People like Cole were survivors. They didn't follow blindly, not anymore. They waited for the moment when the power shifted, and they positioned themselves on the winning side. "I'm not here to burn it down," she said finally, her voice calm, measured. "I'm here to rebuild it. But that won't happen without making a few things right." Cole took a long look at her, as if weighing whether or not he could trust her. "You think McGraw's men are going to just fall in line?" Lil's lips twisted into a wry smile. "I don't expect them to, but I'll make sure they understand who's in charge now." Cole's gaze softened, and he took a seat at the bar. "You've got a hell of a fight ahead of you, Lil, but I think I'm gonna enjoy watching it." Outside, the first rays of morning light touched the dusty streets of Deadwood Springs. The town seemed different now, the silence louder, the air heavier. The wind carried the whispers of change, and those who had once lived in fear now found themselves standing at the edge of a precipice. Some felt hope, while others felt dread. Lil Byrne had taken control of Deadwood Springs, but the question lingered in the air. Would the people rise with her, or would they crumble under the weight of a new ruler? As the day stretched on, the saloon continued to hum with quiet activity. The men who had once fought for McGraw no longer had their leader to turn to. The sharp scent of whiskey mingled with the dust in the air, and the doors creaked open and shut, ushering in the few remaining souls who had nowhere else to go. Lil's presence was undeniable. She sat at the same corner table, calm and composed, her eyes watching every movement in the room. The tension among McGraw's men was thick, but they hadn't made any moves yet. They were waiting for the next step, unsure of whether to challenge her or fall in line. A man in a battered coat stepped into the saloon, his eyes scanning the room with practiced caution. He was tall, his features weathered by years of hard living, and there was something about him that made people take notice. He wasn't afraid to meet anyone's gaze. This was the kind of man who didn't make enemies unless he absolutely had to. The saloon quieted for a moment as he walked toward the bar, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. The bartender, nervous from the last few days of chaos, wiped his hands on his apron before meeting the newcomer's eyes. "What'll it be?" The man didn't answer right away, his gaze still flicking around the room, assessing the situation. "Whiskey," he said finally, his voice low but steady. As the bartender poured the drink, the man took a seat at the bar, his back straight, his hands resting on the worn wood in front of him. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes catching Lil's from across the room. The two of them locked eyes, and in that brief moment, it was clear. This man knew who she was. He knew what she had done. He wasn't here to challenge her, but he wasn't here to follow her either. He was here for something else. He turned back to the bar, waiting for his drink, but Lil knew. She had dealt with men like him before. He wasn't interested in the power she had claimed. He was only interested in what he could take. And that was exactly the kind of person she had to watch out for. The room seemed to tighten with every passing minute. The stranger at the bar hadn't taken his eyes off Lil since they'd locked gazes, and she could feel the weight of his scrutiny pressing down on her. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of a man who had been through more than a few wars. He wasn't the type to be easily intimidated, and that made him dangerous. Dangerous in ways Jake McGraw's men had never been. Lil's hand rested lightly on the edge of her table, her fingers curling slightly as she watched him. The tension between them was palpable, and it was clear that neither of them was willing to make the first move. He had no intention of challenging her openly, but neither did he seem like the kind of man to bow down to her authority. It didn't matter. She had bigger problems to deal with. Her eyes flicked back toward the room, where McGraw's men sat, still nursing their drinks, still unsure of how to proceed. The silence was suffocating, but Lil knew they were all thinking the same thing. How long could they sit in this limbo before making a decision? How long before they chose a side? She wasn't going to give them the luxury of time. With a fluid motion, Lil rose from her seat, her boots making a soft click against the wooden floor as she approached the bar. The stranger didn't flinch, his eyes following her every step, but he didn't speak. His silence only added to the tension in the room. "Whiskey," she said to the bartender, her voice smooth, but with an edge to it. The man hurriedly poured the drink, setting it down in front of her, and Lil took a long sip, savoring the burn as it slid down her throat. As she drank, her gaze shifted back to the group of men at the table, her eyes narrowing as she took in each of their faces. They were waiting for someone to make the first move, to show them where their loyalty should lie. Jake McGraw was dead. The Devil's Hand was no longer in charge. But that didn't mean they were willing to follow Lil just yet. "Well, gentlemen," Lil said, her voice carrying across the room, silencing the murmurs and the shuffling of boots. "Jake's gone. You all know that. But you also know what comes next." The men exchanged uneasy glances, some avoiding her gaze, others unsure of how to react. They were cornered, trapped by their own inaction. Lil could see it in their eyes. The fear, the uncertainty, the longing for someone to tell them what to do. "I'm not here to beg anyone to follow me," Lil continued, her eyes cold and unwavering. "But I'm not going to let anyone stand in my way. You've got a choice to make. Either you stand with me or you step aside." The silence in the room grew heavy, but Lil didn't flinch. She could feel their hesitation. She could feel the weight of their doubt. These men had been followers for so long, used to taking orders, used to the easy life under McGraw's rule. They didn't know what it meant to make their own decisions, to fight for something bigger than their own survival. The man at the bar, the stranger, finally broke his silence, his voice low and measured. "And what makes you think we'll follow you?" Lil turned to face him, her gaze hardening. He wasn't just asking a question. He was challenging her. He was testing her. "What makes you think I need you to follow me?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I don't need anyone, least of all someone who's too scared to make a choice. But I've already made mine." The man stood slowly, the creaking of the chair loud in the stillness. He was tall, imposing, and his worn face showed years of hard living. He was older than Lil, but he had the same fire in his eyes. There was something in his stance that told her he wasn't afraid of her. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly why she liked him. "So you're telling me," he said, his voice rough with a hint of amusement, "that you've come here to take control of a town full of men who are too scared to think for themselves, and you expect them to just fall in line?" Lil didn't flinch. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm telling you that I'm here to take control of a town that's already fallen apart. You can either be a part of the rebuilding, or you can watch it burn." The man seemed to study her for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he took in the weight of her words. Finally, he gave a short, harsh laugh, the sound carrying in the still air. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said, his tone grudgingly admiring. "But you'll learn soon enough that not everyone's going to bow to you, no matter how much fire you've got." "I never asked anyone to bow to me," Lil replied, her eyes locked on his. "I'm not here for loyalty. I'm here for power." The man paused, as if weighing her words, before he nodded slowly, the glint of respect in his eyes. "Well, I'm not here to stop you. But you'll learn quickly that power doesn't come without a price. And it sure as hell doesn't come easy." Lil didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to McGraw's men. The tension in the room was thick, the silence deafening, as if they were all waiting for someone else to speak. She wasn't going to wait any longer. "I'm giving you one last chance," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Anyone who wants to leave can walk out right now. But if you stay, you answer to me. There's no going back." The men exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Some seemed ready to bolt, others hesitated, clearly torn between fear and the undeniable pull of power. But none of them moved. Lil's lips curved into a thin smile. "Good," she said softly. "Now, we can get down to business." The man at the bar watched Lil closely, his expression unreadable. There was a sharpness to her, a ferocity that was undeniable. She wasn't just a gunslinger. She was something more, a force that was about to change the face of Deadwood Springs forever. He knew it, and he wasn't sure whether to admire her or fear her. But one thing was certain, He wasn't going to let her be the only one who made the rules. The game was just beginning. Deadwood Springs was on the edge of something new. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a long shadow over the streets as the day began to slip into twilight. The people of the town, once content under McGraw's iron grip, were now standing at the crossroads. Some had already chosen sides. Either they would fall under Lil's rule or get out of her way. But the question of what would come next lingered in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Inside the Black Coyote Saloon, things were already beginning to shift. The men who had once followed Jake McGraw sat in silence, watching Lil with a mixture of uncertainty and suspicion. They had been waiting for someone to step up, to take control in the aftermath of McGraw's death. They had been waiting for a leader. But now, as Lil's cold gaze swept over them, it was clear. She was that leader. The bartender moved quickly to clear the tables, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't sure whether to be afraid or to feel relief. There had always been something oppressive in the air when McGraw was alive, something that had smothered the life out of the town. But Lil? She was different. There was a sharpness to her, a clarity, and that made the bartender uneasy. Lil took a slow sip of her whiskey, her eyes locked on the men sitting at the bar. The silence stretched long, but she didn't mind. She wasn't in a rush. The power was hers now, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. "You all know why you're still here," she said finally, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Jake McGraw is dead. This town is mine now. You can stay, work for me, or you can leave. There's no middle ground." A murmur rippled through the group of men. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, others glanced at one another, weighing their options. But none of them spoke, not immediately. The man at the bar, Cole, took a swig of whiskey and then turned to face Lil. "You don't make things easy, do you?" Cole said, his voice rough and edged with something darker. "Not everyone in this town is going to bend to you." McGraw was a bastard, but he knew how to keep things running. Lil's eyes never left him as he spoke. There was no fear in her gaze, just the same unflinching coldness that had struck so many men dumb before. "I'm not here to make things easy," Lil replied smoothly. "I'm here to take control." McGraw wasn't fit to lead. "I am." Cole's lips twisted into a half-smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You think you can just walk in here and tell people what to do? This town's been run by men like McGraw for years. You think they'll just roll over for a woman?" Lil's eyes narrowed, but she didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she glanced at the rest of the men, watching their faces, studying their reactions. "I don't care if you like it or not," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "I didn't come here to ask for your approval. I came here to take what's mine." For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room had thickened to the point where it felt like the air itself was choking them. But then, one of McGraw's men, an older, grizzled fellow who had been sitting quietly near the back, finally spoke up. His voice was rough, and he looked like he had lived through more than his fair share of battles. "You really think you can hold this place together? McGraw's gone, but there's still a lot of people who have their own ideas about what happens next," the man said, his eyes locking with Lil's. "You may have killed Jake, but there are plenty of others out there who will come for what you've taken. People with a lot more muscle than you can handle." Lil tilted her head, considering his words. She knew the risks. She wasn't under any illusion that the fight was over. "No, this was only the beginning. I didn't come here to fight just one man, or even one gang," she said, her voice steady. "I came here to take control of everything McGraw built, and I will." There was a long silence before the man spoke again, his voice softer now. "And what happens to the rest of us? You think you can just sweep us aside without any consequences?" Lil's eyes never left his as she set her glass down with a deliberate motion. She knew that the men in this room had seen things, done things that would make most people's stomachs churn. They weren't going to be easy to control. They wouldn't follow her because of some ideal or vision of a better town. They would follow her because she could give them what they wanted: power, money, protection. And they would follow her, or they would be gone. "If you're useful to me," she said softly, "you can stay. If you're not, you're gone. No second chances." Her words hung in the air for a long moment, the weight of them settling heavily on the men. The older man nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Lil. "Maybe you're right," he muttered. "But you'll need more than just words if you plan on holding on to this town." Lil smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was the smile of someone who had already won. "I'll have everything I need," she said, her voice firm. "And if anyone gets in my way, I'll make sure they regret it." Outside, the sky had begun to darken, and the streets of Deadwood Springs were empty. The saloon, once the heartbeat of the town, was now a quiet, eerie place, and the people of Deadwood Springs had retreated to their homes, unsure of what to make of the new power that had arrived. In the distance, a lone rider appeared on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He was moving fast, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust as he approached the town. Lil's eyes flicked toward the door as the man rode into view, his figure drawing closer with each passing moment. She knew who he was. The lone rider approached with an air of quiet urgency, his horse kicking up dust as it galloped down the main street of Deadwood Springs. The sound of hooves on the wooden boards echoed in the silence that had settled over the town. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dirt roads, but the man didn't slow down. He was on a mission, and Lil could feel the tension rise in her chest as she watched him draw closer. The door to the Black Coyote Saloon swung open with a creak as the man dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. His face was still hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but Lil could see the way he moved. There was no hesitation, no fear in his posture. This was a man who had seen the worst the West had to offer and lived to tell the tale. Lil didn't wait for him to make the first move. She was already on her feet, her eyes fixed on the stranger as he stepped into the saloon. The air inside seemed to still, the murmurs and low voices quieting as his presence filled the room. The bartender stiffened, his eyes darting nervously between the newcomer and Lil, but he didn't speak. The man lifted his head slightly, just enough for Lil to catch a glimpse of his features, rough, scarred, and familiar. She'd seen him before, heard his name whispered in the dark corners of the town. His name was Gus Hollister, and he wasn't just a stranger. He was a bounty hunter, one of the most ruthless men in the region. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. They both knew exactly why he had come. "You're the one," Gus said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "The one who took McGraw down." Lil didn't flinch. "I'm the one who took control of this town." Gus gave a short, humorless laugh. "Control? You think you've got control here? This town's been a powder keg for years. It'll blow up in your face if you're not careful." Lil's gaze never wavered, her fingers twitching slightly as she assessed the man in front of her. She'd heard the rumors about Gus Hollister, how he could track down anyone, how he always got his bounty. He was a man with few morals and a lot of blood on his hands, but he wasn't here for her. "Not yet. I'm not looking for your advice, Hollister," she said, her tone steady but sharp. "I'm here to make sure McGraw's legacy doesn't drag this town down with him. If you're here to stop me, you're in the wrong place." Gus studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took a step closer. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to see if you're strong enough to keep it together. I'm not some hired gun for your little power play, lady. I came to see what you've got, what you're really made of." Lil didn't move. She had no need to prove herself to anyone, least of all a man like Gus Hollister. But she understood the unspoken challenge. He wasn't impressed by her title. He wasn't interested in how many men she'd killed or what she had done to McGraw's empire. He was here to see if she could hold her ground. "You've got a lot of nerve," Lil said softly, a glint of something dangerous in her eyes. "But I don't think you came all the way here to test me. You came here because you want something?" Gus's lips twisted into a grin. "Smart," he said, tipping his hat back slightly. "You're right. I didn't ride all this way to play games. I'm here because I need to know if you're serious. The West's full of people who say they're going to take control, and they always fall apart sooner or later. I'm just looking for a safe bet." "You think I'm a bet?" Lil replied, her voice calm but tinged with a warning. "You think I'm some gamble you can take a chance on? No, I'm the real deal. And if you want to survive in this town, you'll learn that real quick." The tension between them hung thick, as if they were both waiting for the other to make the next move. But Gus just stood there, looking at her, sizing her up like one might size up an opponent in a high-stakes poker game. He wasn't scared. He wasn't intimidated. He was simply watching, waiting. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low but edged with something far more dangerous than the casual tone he had used before. "I don't care about your game, lady," Gus said, his gaze never leaving hers. "But you'd better know that this town's full of people who don't want you here. You've made a lot of enemies by taking out McGraw, and they'll come for you sooner or later. And when they do, you'll need more than just a quick draw and a sharp tongue to survive." Lil didn't flinch. She knew what he was getting at. He was testing her, seeing how she would react to his warning, but she wasn't the type to back down. Not to him. Not to anyone. "I don't need anyone's protection," she said, her voice cold and sure. "I can take care of myself, and when they come for me, I'll make sure they regret it." Gus gave a short nod, seemingly satisfied by her answer. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, maybe, but it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You're right about one thing," he said, turning toward the door. "You'll need more than just a quick draw. But if you want help, you know where to find me." And with that, Gus Hollister turned and walked out of the saloon, his boots echoing against the wooden floor as he disappeared into the night. The door swung shut behind him, leaving the saloon in a heavy silence once again. Lil stood still, her gaze lingering on the door for a moment before she turned back to the men who were still seated at the bar. They hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. "You all heard him," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "The West is full of people who don't like change. But I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you, unless you plan on leaving this town for good." They nodded slowly, one by one. They were starting to understand. She wasn't just another outlaw. She wasn't just someone looking to fill the void McGraw had left behind. She was a force. And Deadwood Springs was about to find out just how much she was willing to do to make sure it stayed hers. The sun had disappeared completely now, and the chill of the desert night began to settle over Deadwood Springs. But inside the saloon, Lil was already thinking ahead. Gus Hollister's warning hadn't fallen on deaf ears. She knew what was coming, and she was ready for it. But the question remained. Would the people of Deadwood Springs be ready to stand with her when the real fight began? The night in Deadwood Springs carried with it a palpable sense of anticipation, as though the whole town was holding its breath. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale, silver light across the streets, and the only sound that filled the air was the distant whisper of wind through the dust. Inside the Black Coyote Saloon, the once boisterous crowd had thinned, leaving behind only a handful of men, nursing their drinks, their eyes flicking toward the door every time it creaked open. Lil Burns sat at her table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes scanning the room. The stranger, Gus Hollister, had come and gone, leaving behind a sense of unease. He had left without a word, but his message had been clear. If she thought her victory over Jake McGraw was the end of her troubles, she was sorely mistaken. There were still forces out there, in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Lil wasn't the type to wait. She had taken control of Deadwood Springs, and she wasn't about to give it up to anyone. She took another sip from her glass, savoring the burn as it slid down her throat. The men in the saloon were watching her, trying to gauge her next move, but they were like wolves waiting for the alpha to show weakness. They wouldn't see it. Not from her. The doors swung open again, and the bartender, who had been eyeing the door nervously all night, stiffened. A figure stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, casting a long shadow across the room. "Don't just stand there. Close the damn door," Lil called without looking up. The man did as instructed, the door slamming shut with a heavy thud. He walked toward the bar with a purpose, his eyes locking on Lil for a brief moment before he settled onto a stool. Lil didn't need to look at him to know who he was. His presence alone gave him away. Another of McGraw's men. This one was different, though. He wasn't here to fight her. No, he had a different mission. She could feel it. He had come to test her, just like Gus had. "I heard you were in charge now." The man's voice was deep, rough, carrying the weight of someone who had lived through years of violence and bloodshed. "McGraw's dead. That's the word on the street. Lil didn't respond right away. She took another sip of her whiskey, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Yeah, I'm in charge now, she said finally, her voice smooth, but with an edge that couldn't be ignored. So, what's it to you? The man didn't hesitate. He sat back on his stool, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the bar. He wasn't intimidated by her, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of respect, maybe, or maybe just curiosity. I'm not here to start trouble, he said slowly. I'm here to make sure you know what you're getting into. This town isn't just about McGraw. It's bigger than that. There's money, power, and blood on the line. People will come for what you've taken, and some of them won't be as polite as I am. Lil glanced over at him then, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had heard the whispers, rumors of power struggles brewing in other towns, battles between rival factions for control of the West's lawless heart. But none of that mattered now. She was the one holding the reins of Deadwood Springs, and she wasn't about to back down from anyone. Do you think I'm afraid of a few men with guns? She asked, her voice laced with a biting sarcasm. I didn't kill McGraw and take his empire just to turn tail when someone else shows up. I'm here to stay. The man let out a low chuckle, but his eyes didn't leave hers. I'm not saying you're scared. I'm saying you need to be careful. You've taken the crown, but it doesn't come with peace. It comes with enemies. McGraw had plenty of them. You think they'll just forget you killed their boss? I'll make them forget, Lil said coldly. One way or another. The man studied her for a long moment, as though weighing her words. Finally, he sighed, standing from his stool. Maybe you're right. Maybe you've got the guts to hold this town together. But if you want to keep it, you'll need more than just a gun and a sharp tongue. You'll need to earn it. Earn the respect of the people who matter. Lil didn't respond. She had no interest in his advice. She was done playing games. This was her town now, and she would make sure everyone knew it. Without another word, the man turned and left, his footsteps fading into the night. The silence in the saloon lingered long after he was gone. The men who had been watching Lil began to mutter among themselves, their voices low, filled with uncertainty. It was clear that they didn't know what to make of her, whether to follow her or to resist. But Lil wasn't concerned with them. She had bigger problems. She had to make a decision. Outside, the shadows were growing longer as the night deepened. Lil stood from her table, the decision weighing heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just a gunslinger anymore. She wasn't just taking down outlaws for money. She had something bigger now, something that people would kill to control, Deadwood Springs. But she wasn't the only one with eyes on it. The bounty hunter had been right about one thing. McGraw's empire had enemies, and they were out there, watching, waiting for their chance to strike. It was time to act. Lil walked out of the saloon, the cool night air hitting her face as she stepped into the street. Her eyes scanned the town, the buildings dimly lit by the flickering lamps. She knew what she had to do. The first move had been hers, taking McGraw's life, taking control of the town. But now, she had to solidify her position. She needed to make sure the people knew who was in charge. She needed to send a message. Lil wasn't going to wait around for someone else to make the next move. She would be the one to decide what happened next, and anyone who stood in her way would regret it. The cold wind of the night carried a promise of change as it swept through the empty streets of Deadwood Springs. The quiet hum of the town seemed to have taken on a more sinister tone after the events in the saloon. Whispers of Lil Byrne's victory had spread like wildfire, but not all of them were spoken with reverence. Some feared her. Others doubted her. And in a town like this, doubt was as dangerous as a loaded gun. Lil stepped out into the street, her boots kicking up dust as she walked with purpose. The night felt alive with tension, and she could feel every eye on her, even if she couldn't see them. The shadows between the buildings seemed to stretch longer, watching her every step. But she didn't care. She had no time for fear. She was the storm now, and no one could stop her. Her first order of business was clear. She needed to solidify her power. Taking McGraw's life had been the easy part. Keeping Deadwood Springs under her thumb was going to require more than just a few good shots. It was going to require strategy. It was going to require making sure everyone knew she was in charge. There was one man who could help her do that. One man whose loyalty could mean the difference between success and failure. His name was Dalton Carr, and he wasn't just any man. He was the town sheriff. Carr had been McGraw's man too, at least on the surface. But there were cracks in that alliance, cracks Lil knew she could exploit. She had no intention of starting a war with the sheriff. In fact, she needed him. But she needed him to understand that his position in this town was no longer guaranteed. If he wanted to keep his badge, he would have to bend to her will. Lil had learned long ago that alliances were made and broken with a few well-placed words. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to take control. The sheriff's office was located at the far end of town, a squat, unremarkable building that sat in the shadows like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Lil could hear the distant sound of the creak as she approached, her boots clicking against the wooden boards. She wasn't worried about being seen. The town was quiet tonight, too quiet. That meant only one thing. People were waiting, watching, ready for whatever came next. She reached the door of the sheriff's office and knocked once, sharp and firm. There was a long pause before she heard footsteps from inside. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Dalton Carr. The sheriff was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face that looked like it had been carved out of stone. His eyes were hard, but not unkind. Lil could see the hesitation in his gaze as he looked her up and down, but he didn't speak. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, waiting. "I need to talk to you, Sheriff," Lil said, her voice cool and calm. She wasn't here to beg. She wasn't here to plead. She was here for results. Dalton Carr didn't move. "And what makes you think I'll listen to you?" he asked, his voice gruff but steady. Lil's eyes narrowed slightly, and she stepped closer. "Because you don't have a choice," she said simply. "McGraw is dead. The town is mine now. If you want to keep your badge, you'll follow my lead." Carr's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Lil wondered if he was going to throw her out. But instead, he stepped back and gestured for her to enter. "Come inside," he said, his voice low. "Let's talk." Inside the sheriff's office, the air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke and dust. A single oil lamp flickered on the desk, casting long shadows across the room. There was a quiet tension in the space, and Lil could feel it pressing down on her chest as she took a seat across from Carr. He settled into his own chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't pull any punches, do you?" Carr asked after a long moment of silence. Lil didn't respond immediately. She wasn't here to play games. The only thing that mattered now was taking control, and making sure Carr understood that his days of making decisions on his own were over. "No," she said finally, her voice steady. "I don't have time for games. McGraw's dead. He had his chance, and now it's mine. I'm not asking you to like it. I'm telling you how it is." Carr leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "So what do you want from me?" "I want you to keep the peace," Lil said, her tone hardening. "I want you to make sure there's no bloodshed in the streets. I want you to make sure the people know that Deadwood Springs is under new management. If you help me do that, you get to keep your badge. If you don't, well, we'll see how long you last." Carr didn't respond immediately, but Lil could see the wheels turning in his head. He was weighing his options, thinking about how much power he could maintain if he agreed to her terms. He was an intelligent man, one who understood the dangers of being on the wrong side of a power struggle. Finally, he sighed. "You're right about one thing. McGraw had his time, and it's over. But this town, it's been under his rule for too long. People don't change overnight. If you're really planning on taking control, you better be ready for the consequences." Lil leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "I've been ready for this my whole life." Carr nodded slowly. "All right, Lil. I'll help you. But you better be ready. There's a lot more to keeping control than just killing one man." "I know," she said, her lips curling into a thin smile. "But I've already taken the first step." As she stood to leave, Carr's voice stopped her. "One more thing. If you want to really make your mark here, you'll need more than just power. You'll need loyalty. And loyalty doesn't come easy in a place like this." Lil paused, her back still to him. She could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. But she didn't turn around. She had heard it all before. Loyalty, trust, the things that men tried to use to control others. Loyalty, she said with a dark chuckle, is earned. And I plan on earning it. With that, she turned and walked out of the sheriff's office, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that echoed in the night. Deadwood Springs was hers, and the next phase of her plan was about to unfold. The next morning in Deadwood Springs was shrouded in a stillness that felt unnatural. The usual hustle and bustle of the town, where wagons rattled along the dusty roads and the sharp clink of coins echoed from the saloon, had been replaced with an eerie silence. People moved with purpose, but there was a hesitation in their step, as though they weren't sure which direction to take next. Lil had been up since dawn, her mind already working through the next steps of her plan. The sheriff had agreed to her terms, but as she had known, that was just the beginning. Deadwood Springs wasn't just a town to be controlled. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. It would take more than just a sharp tongue and a quick draw to keep it under her rule. She had to show the people that she wasn't just another outlaw trying to take McGraw's place. She had to prove that her vision for the town was the only one worth following. As Lil walked toward the Black Coyote Saloon, she noticed a group of men standing in the distance, their eyes watching her with an intensity that she couldn't quite place. She didn't flinch. She knew what they were thinking. They were wondering if she could actually hold on to the power she had taken. They were wondering how long it would be before someone else came to challenge her. But Lil was unshaken. She had already killed McGraw and sent a message to anyone who thought they could take the town back. The next move was hers, and she wasn't about to let anyone steal it from her. The saloon doors creaked open as she stepped inside, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. The usual patrons were already there, though the atmosphere was tense. Conversations stopped as she entered, every eye in the room turning toward her. But Lil didn't hesitate. She walked to the bar, her eyes locking on the bartender as she took a seat. "What's it going to be today?" the bartender asked, his voice low and cautious. "Whiskey," she replied, her gaze sweeping the room. As the bartender poured her drink, the silence in the room grew heavier. The men at the tables had been waiting for this moment. They had been waiting for Lil to take control, to prove that she wasn't just another killer with a dream of taking over. They had been watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. They had been waiting for her to show them she wasn't the one they should follow. But Lil wasn't going to make that mistake. She wasn't going to give them any reason to doubt her. Her eyes met the men who had been watching her, and she held their gaze, unwavering. They could try to intimidate her, but it wouldn't work. She didn't need to say anything. Her mere presence in the room spoke volumes. The doors swung open again, and this time, a man stepped inside, a familiar figure. Gus Hollister, the bounty hunter from last night. He walked with a purpose, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Lil. Without a word, he made his way to the bar and stood next to her, leaning on the counter. Well, Gus said, his voice low and gritty. "I didn't think I'd be seeing you again so soon." Lil turned to face him, her gaze steady. "What do you want, Hollister?" Gus chuckled, his lips curling into a half-smile. "I don't want anything, not yet anyway. But I've been hearing some things around town. People are talking. You've got the power, but you don't have their loyalty." "Not yet." Lil's eyes narrowed, her hand resting on the edge of her drink. "Loyalty comes with time, and I'm not in a rush." "You should be," Gus said, his tone suddenly serious. "Loyalty is the only thing that matters when things start to fall apart. You think these men are going to follow you just because you killed McGraw? They're not that simple. They're looking for something more. If you want to keep this town under your control, you'll have to give them something they can't walk away from." Lil didn't respond right away. She had heard the warnings before, about how difficult it would be to keep control of a town like Deadwood Springs. But she didn't need loyalty from anyone who wasn't willing to earn it. She wasn't here to play nice. She was here to take what was hers, and anyone who got in her way would regret it. "I've already given them something they can't walk away from," she said quietly, her eyes meeting Gus's. "I've given them a new way of life. A way that doesn't rely on the likes of McGraw." Gus studied her for a moment, his gaze calculating. "Maybe you're right, but you still haven't earned their respect. You haven't shown them what you're really made of. You've got to give them a reason to fight for you, not just fear you." Lil's lips curled into a faint smile. "I've already shown them what I'm made of. Now, I'm going to show them what I can do with this town." Gus looked at her for a long moment before he nodded slowly. All right, you're a woman with fire. But fire burns, Lil. And not everyone can survive it. She stood up from the bar, her eyes never leaving his. Then let them try. If they can't survive it, they're not worth my time. Without another word, Lil turned and walked toward the door. The room watched her leave in silence, the weight of her words lingering in the air. Outside, the wind had picked up, swirling dust around her boots as she stepped into the street. The town was quiet, but that wouldn't last. She could feel the tension in the air, the storm that was brewing just below the surface. It wouldn't take much for everything to erupt. But Lil wasn't afraid of a fight. She had come to Deadwood Springs to take control, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. It was time to make her mark. The early morning sun hung low over Deadwood Springs, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the town. The usual hum of life, the clatter of boots, the rattle of carts, the occasional raucous laughter from the Black Coyote Saloon, had been replaced by something heavier, something darker. Lil Byrne had walked into the saloon last night with a fire in her eyes, a fire that still burned as she sat in the sheriff's office, watching the town outside through the dusty window. She had spent the last few hours strategizing, laying the groundwork for what came next. She knew what was coming. She could feel it in the air. The men she had stared down last night weren't the only ones questioning her rule. There were others, people out there, in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make their move. But she wasn't going to wait for them. She was going to strike first. Dalton Carr, the sheriff, had promised to help her keep the peace. But she knew better than to rely on anyone, even him. In a town like this, you either ruled or you were ruled, and Lil had no intention of being anyone's pawn. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The day was moving faster than she had anticipated, but time was running out. If she was going to make her mark on Deadwood Springs, she needed to act now. Outside, the sound of footsteps in the dirt pulled her from her thoughts. She recognized the boots, the heavy thud of someone walking with purpose. The door to the sheriff's office creaked open, and in walked Gus Hollister, his silhouette outlined by the sun behind him. His face was unreadable, but the look in his eyes was familiar. It was the look of a man who had come to deliver bad news. Lil, Gus said, his voice rough, as he took a seat across from her. We've got a problem. Lil didn't flinch. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment she took McGraw's life. This town wasn't going to let her rule without a fight. And the first shots had already been fired. What kind of problem? She asked, her tone flat, as if she had been expecting this conversation all along. Gus's eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening. Words getting around. There's a group of men, outsiders, looking to take advantage of the chaos. They've been gathering just outside town. They're armed, organized, and they don't look like they're here for a friendly chat. Lil leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming against the worn wood of the desk. How many are there? 20, maybe more, Gus replied. Too many for a town like this to handle if they decide to make a move. Lil's mind raced as she calculated her next move. She had always known this day would come. She had taken McGraw's throne, but power, as she'd learned the hard way, was never permanent. There would always be someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opening, looking for weakness. But there was no room for weakness now. She had to act fast. If she didn't, Deadwood Springs would fall into the hands of men who didn't care about the people who lived here, men who only saw it as another stop on their journey to power. How far out are they? Lil asked, her voice low, steady. They've set up camp a few miles east of here, Gus replied. I don't know what they want yet, but it's clear they're preparing for something big. If we don't do something, they'll come for us. Lil didn't hesitate. She had already made her decision. She wasn't going to let anyone take control of her town, not without a fight. Gather every man we can trust, she said, her voice firm, authoritative. We ride out at sundown. We end this before it even begins. Gus didn't argue. He knew that Lil wasn't someone who backed down from a fight, and neither was he. They'd both seen too much blood spilled in the streets to be afraid of what was coming. As he stood to leave, he paused. You sure about this? You're willing to risk it all? This could be a trap, Lil. We don't know what we're walking into. I'm not walking into anything, Lil said, her eyes flashing with determination. "We're going out there to take control. Either they bend to my will, or they're gone. Simple as that." Gus nodded slowly. "All right then. I'll get the men ready. We'll meet you at the edge of town." Lil stood up from her chair, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her shoulders. She had spent her life running, fighting, and surviving. She wasn't about to let some band of outsiders take what she had fought so hard to build. As she stepped out of the sheriff's office and into the street, the sky above her was a dull orange, the sun sinking lower in the horizon. She could feel the eyes of Deadwood Springs on her as she made her way toward the saloon. The town was about to see what kind of woman Lil Byrne was. She wasn't just some outlaw. She was a force. And tonight, she would show everyone just how far she was willing to go to make sure Deadwood Springs remained hers. The Black Coyote Saloon was already beginning to fill up with men preparing for the fight. Their faces were tense, their hands fidgeting as they tried to shake off the nervous energy that clung to them. But Lil didn't see fear in their eyes. She saw something else. Determination. They had followed McGraw because he had given them power, and they had followed her because she had taken it. Now, she was going to give them something else. A reason to fight. She stood in front of them, her voice steady, unwavering. "You all know why we're here. There's a group of men outside of town, looking to take what's ours. They think they can walk in and take control. But that's not how things work around here. This town is mine, and anyone who wants to take it from me will have to go through me first." A murmur ran through the room, but no one objected. They were with her. She could feel it in their eyes. They were ready. "We ride out at sundown," she said, her voice cold and sure. "Get your weapons. This is the moment we take control or we die trying." The men nodded, and one by one, they filtered out of the saloon, preparing for the battle ahead. Lil watched them go, her gaze steady, her mind already working through the plan. This would be the defining moment. The moment that would either solidify her rule over Deadwood Springs or shatter it. But Lil Byrne wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. As the sun sank lower on the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples, Deadwood Springs seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with tension, the kind of heavy silence that always preceded violence. The men in the Black Coyote Saloon were preparing for a battle they hadn't expected, but now that it had come, they were ready. The sound of boots pounding against the dusty ground filled the air as they gathered their weapons, checking their rifles and pistols, readying themselves for the fight ahead. Lil stood in front of the saloon, her eyes focused on the road that led out of town, where the group of men had set up camp. She could feel the weight of their gaze on her. The townspeople, the ones who had stayed in Deadwood Springs, watching from windows and doorways, wondering if their new leader was up to the challenge. The wind tugged at her coat, but it wasn't enough to shake her confidence. She knew what she had to do, and no one was going to take it from her. Gus Hollister had already assembled the men they could trust, a dozen or so hardened individuals who had no allegiance except to whoever held the power. They didn't care about loyalty, they cared about survival, and right now, Lil was their best chance. The others, the ones who had hesitated the night before, had stayed behind. They would be left to pick up the pieces of Deadwood Springs after the battle was over, or they would be gone, their loyalty too weak to survive. "Are we ready?" Lil asked, her voice low, but filled with the conviction of a woman who knew what was at stake. Gus nodded, stepping up beside her. "They're waiting for us. We ride hard, we ride fast, but we can't give them time to react." "Good," Lil replied, her jaw set. "Then let's make sure they don't see us coming." With that, the small group of men mounted their horses, the creaking of leather and the sound of hooves stirring up the dust as they made their way out of Deadwood Springs, moving swiftly under the cover of the fading light. Lil led the way, her dark silhouette framed by the dying sun, her mind focused on one thing: ensuring that the group of men threatening her town would never get the chance to take it from her. The camp was set up just outside Deadwood Springs, hidden in the brush just past the bend in the road. A dozen men, maybe more, were sitting around a fire, laughing and talking, completely unaware of the danger heading their way. They had come from the north, moving fast, with the scent of trouble on their heels. Lil could feel the heat in her veins as she approached, her heartbeat steady and sure. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing that once she silenced this threat, no one would dare challenge her again. As they neared the camp, Lil signaled for the men to dismount. The horses shifted nervously under them, but the group was calm, well-trained. They knew what they had to do. They knew how to fight. Lil crept forward with Gus at her side, their eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. She could hear the voices of the men growing louder as they neared the camp. Her fingers tightened on the grip of her pistol. She wasn't here to talk. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to win. As they broke from the cover of the trees, Lil's voice rang out, low but commanding. "Move out." The men sprang into action, bursting from the shadows, weapons raised. The band of outlaws barely had time to react. Some reached for their guns, others froze in shock, their hands caught in the air. But Lil was faster. A gunshot rang out, followed by another, and the camp erupted into chaos. Men scattered in every direction, scrambling for cover as shots rang out from all sides. Lil moved with purpose, taking down anyone who posed a threat, her movements swift and decisive. There was no hesitation, no mercy. She had made her choice the moment she set foot in this town, and she would not let anyone tear it from her. Gus fired a shot, dropping one of the men who had been trying to reach for his rifle, and Lil kept moving, her eyes scanning the chaos. She could see the fear in the men's eyes, the realization that they had been caught completely off guard. But it was too late for them to run. "You picked the wrong town," Lil muttered under her breath as she fired again, this time catching one of the men in the shoulder. He fell to the ground, his weapon slipping from his hand. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, and it wasn't long before the camp was silent. The men who had dared to challenge her were either dead or wounded, sprawled out across the dirt. Those who remained standing had dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Lil stood over them, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a woman who had just fought for everything she had worked for. She looked down at the men who had thought they could come in and take control. They had underestimated her. Now, they would learn the cost of that mistake. "I told you," she said, her voice cold and hard. "This town is mine." Gus walked up beside her, wiping blood from his hands. "That's one problem dealt with. But there'll be more. You know that, right?" Lil turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I know. But now they know what happens when they cross me." With a sharp motion, she signaled for the men to round up the prisoners, those who were still breathing. They were no longer a threat. Now, they were a message. "We'll take them back to town," Lil said, her voice steady. "Make sure everyone knows what happens when they try to take something that isn't theirs." Back in Deadwood Springs, the people were already gathering, their faces filled with fear and curiosity. They had heard the gunshots, seen the dust rising in the distance, and now they were waiting for the inevitable return of the men who had gone out to face the threat. Lil rode back into town, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could see the looks on their faces. There were no cheers, no applause, just silence. They had seen what she was capable of, and they were waiting to see if she would be their savior, or if she would burn the town to the ground with her ambition. But Lil wasn't here to play to their expectations. She wasn't here to be their hero. She was here to rule. The men she had captured were paraded through the streets, their hands tied, their faces battered and bloodied. The people of Deadwood Springs stood in silence, watching as the prisoners were led to the center of town, where Lil stopped them. "I did what needed to be done," Lil said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "And this is the price of trying to take what's mine." Her eyes swept the crowd, and for the first time, she could see the flicker of understanding in their eyes. They weren't afraid of her. Not anymore. They were beginning to see that she wasn't just another outlaw. She was their leader, and no one was going to take that from her. Deadwood Springs had never been a quiet town, but tonight, the silence was deafening. The streets were still, the faint murmur of the crowd lingering in the air as Lil Burns stood in front of the prisoners. The defeated men who had come to take what wasn't theirs were now being held by the townsfolk, their eyes empty, staring at the ground. The power Lil had demonstrated tonight wasn't just in her strength or her quick draw. It was in the way she had controlled the moment, how she had taken the reins of this town and made sure the message was loud and clear. Deadwood Springs was hers. The prisoners, bloodied and broken from the fight, were a symbol. She knew what they represented. Those who would challenge her, those who would come for what she had earned. They were nothing more than a warning, and she intended to make sure everyone knew what would happen to anyone else who tried. But the town had witnessed this. They had seen her fight, seen her claim power with no mercy. The faces of the townsfolk were painted with uncertainty, some with admiration and others with fear. But all of them were watching her now. Every eye trained on the woman who had killed McGraw and wiped out the men who had come after her. Lil's eyes swept the crowd, her gaze hard and steady. There were still those who would doubt her, who would challenge her leadership. She could feel it in the air, a weight, a subtle shift beneath the surface. People didn't follow easily. They needed more than just bloodshed. They needed something to hold on to, something to believe in. She took a step forward, her boots grinding into the dirt beneath her feet. She didn't speak at first. She wanted them to understand the weight of the silence. She wasn't here to beg for their loyalty. She wasn't here to win their favor. She was here to show them that this was her town now, and no one could take it from her. After a moment, Lil spoke, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "You saw what happened out there," she said, her words sharp, unwavering. "Those men thought they could come in and take what they wanted. They thought they could walk into Deadwood Springs and make it their own. But I told them, just like I'm telling all of you now, this town belongs to me." Her gaze swept over the faces of the crowd, her expression cold but confident. "I didn't come here to play nice. I came here to take control, to make this town stronger, to make sure no one ever walks in here and thinks they can take what we've built. We're stronger together, but we're stronger because we know who's in charge. And that's me." There was a long silence, the weight of her words settling heavily in the air. But it wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear. It was the silence of the town coming to terms with the fact that Lil Byrne was their leader now. The men she had captured were dragged to their knees before her, their heads bowed in defeat. One by one, she turned her gaze to them, her eyes unyielding. "I told you," she said softly, "that this town belongs to me. You tried to take it from me, and now you'll pay the price." With a single motion, she gestured for the townsfolk to bring forward the rope. It was an old practice, something that had been done in the past when people wanted to send a message. Lil wasn't interested in theatrics. She wasn't interested in making an example of them for the crowd's entertainment. She was here to show them who ruled, and it was the only message that mattered. "Make sure the rest of the town sees what happens to those who think they can take this town from me," she said coldly. "Let them know that the price of defying me is a price no one will pay." As the rope was tied to the men, Lil turned and walked away, leaving them to the fate they had earned. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The town had already learned the lesson she wanted to teach. And as she walked back to the saloon, she could feel the eyes on her again, watching, waiting, seeing if she would break. She wouldn't. Inside the saloon, Gus Hollister was waiting for her. He stood near the bar, his expression unreadable. But there was something different in his gaze when she entered. It wasn't just respect. It was something deeper. He had been watching her, measuring her. And now, he knew. "That was bold," Gus said, his voice low. "But you did what you had to do. They'll either fall in line or they'll leave." Lil nodded. "They'll fall in line, or they'll leave. Either way, this town is mine." Gus watched her for a moment longer, then reached for a bottle behind the bar and poured a drink for both of them. "You don't pull any punches, do you?" "No," Lil said, accepting the glass and taking a slow sip. "Not when the stakes are this high." There was a pause before Gus spoke again. "There's something I think you should know. Word's already spreading. There are people out there, people who have heard about what you did here. And they're coming." Lil met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Let them come. I'm not afraid of them." Gus didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lil. But if you can keep this up, if you can keep Deadwood Springs under your thumb, there won't be anyone left to challenge you." Lil smirked, the fire in her eyes flickering. "Good. Because this is just the beginning." Outside, the wind began to pick up, swirling dust in the air. Lil felt the weight of the future pressing down on her. The battle for Deadwood Springs wasn't over. It had only just begun, but she was ready, and no one was going to take this town from her. The winds had shifted in Deadwood Springs. The once peaceful town, now haunted by the aftermath of Lil Byrne's brutal rise to power, was on edge. The men she had silenced, and those who had been forced to watch, were beginning to realize that nothing would be the same again. Deadwood Springs was no longer a town where they could come and go as they pleased. Now, it was a place where power was not given. It was taken, and it was held with an iron grip. Lil stood on the balcony of the Black Coyote Saloon, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting a dark shadow over the town. The streets below were still, but she could feel the tension in the air. It was only a matter of time before the next challenge came. Another gang, another man hoping to carve out his piece of the town. But this time, Lil wouldn't wait. She wouldn't let them get comfortable. Her eyes flicked toward the saloon doors. The men from the fight had been handled, but there were still plenty of others who had yet to show their true colors. She needed to take control now, before the town had a chance to fracture, before the rumors started spreading. It was clear to her now. If she didn't strike first, someone else would. How long do you think it'll take before someone else tries? Gus Hollister's voice came from behind her, breaking her concentration. She didn't turn to face him, but she could feel his presence at her back. His calculated movements, his eyes that always seemed to see through her. "I don't care how long it takes," Lil replied, her voice calm, but filled with an undeniable edge. "When they come, I'll be ready. I won't give them the chance to start something they can't finish." Gus stepped closer, leaning against the railing beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't say anything at first, but the quiet between them spoke volumes. "You've already made your mark, but it won't be enough," Gus said, his voice more serious now. "There are too many people in this town who think they can take it from you. You've got McGraw's enemies still lingering out there, waiting for their shot. They'll try to chip away at what you've built. They won't do it outright. They'll move quietly, make alliances, find your weak points." Lil's gaze sharpened. "And what do you suggest I do, Gus? Sit around and wait for them to come for me?" "No," Gus answered, his voice low and measured. "You need to act now. You've got to show the people here, the ones who are still questioning you, that they have no other choice but to follow you. You've got to take every advantage and turn it into a strength." Lil turned her eyes on him, her expression hardening. "What do you mean?" "You have control now." "Sure," Gus said, his eyes narrowing as if weighing something in his mind. "But there's more you can do. People follow strength. And the stronger you appear, the more loyal they'll be. You've already shown them you'll kill to keep your power. But you need to show them you'll lead them to something more than just survival." Lil didn't reply immediately. She stood still, letting his words sink in. It was true. Her blood-soaked victory over McGraw and the Bandits had secured her the title of leader, but that wasn't enough. In a place like Deadwood Springs, leadership had to be more than just force. It had to be vision. It had to be ambition. She turned to face Gus, her eyes fierce with a newfound clarity. "I'm not here just to keep the peace. I'm here to build something. I'll make them want to follow me." Gus met her gaze, a silent approval flickering in his eyes. "That's the spirit. But you'll need more than just words. You need to show them what you can build, something they can't get anywhere else." A man like Gus understood what it meant to build an empire. He had seen enough of them rise and fall. But Lil didn't need to build an empire in the traditional sense. She needed to forge something else: loyalty, respect, fear, and most of all, trust. She had to make them see that no one else could give them what she could. The next day, Lil gathered the men who had been loyal to McGraw, the ones who hadn't fled when the guns started firing. She needed them to understand her vision, but most of all, she needed them to believe in it. She needed them to know she wasn't just taking McGraw's place. She was taking the town and making it her own. The Black Coyote Saloon buzzed with activity as the men filed in, some nervous, others with the calculated air of veterans who had seen too many gunfights and too much bloodshed to be rattled. They took their seats at the long tables, eyes shifting to Lil as she stood in front of them. She didn't waste time. "McGraw's dead. His reign is over. Now, I'm in charge. But you're all still here. That means you're either loyal, or you're still deciding where you stand." One of the men shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand resting on his gun. "We're still waiting to see how things turn out," he muttered. Lil's eyes cut to him like a knife. "You're not the only one who's waiting. We're all waiting. But if you don't make a decision soon, you won't have a place in this town. I'm not here to play games. I'm here to make Deadwood Springs stronger than it's ever been. If you want to be a part of that, stay. If not, leave now. There's no room for weakness, only strength." The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of boots. She could feel their gaze on her, judging her, waiting to see if she could truly lead them. But she didn't wait. She let the silence stretch, and when no one stood, she continued. "I'm not asking for loyalty. I'm demanding it. And if you want to survive here, you'll follow me. I'm going to show you what this town can be. But it's going to take work. It's going to take more than just surviving the next fight. It's going to take everything we've got. I will lead you to the future. You just have to follow." The men exchanged looks, and one by one, they nodded, silently acknowledging their decision. The balance of power had shifted, and they knew it. As the meeting broke up, Lil stood at the bar, her gaze still hard. She knew this was just the beginning. She had taken the first step. Now, she would take the town. But there were others who would try to take her place. Others who wouldn't hesitate to challenge her authority. Lil wasn't afraid of them. She would be the one to strike first. And Deadwood Springs would never be the same. The horizon was still painted with the glow of the early morning sun when Lil Burns stood at the edge of Deadwood Springs, her eyes scanning the distant horizon. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the dry dust that swirled around the town, a constant reminder of the harsh landscape that defined the West. This town, this desolate place, had become hers, but the weight of ownership wasn't something she took lightly. She could feel the eyes of the people on her, the uncertainty in their stares, the hope and fear interwoven in every glance. Lil wasn't here to play their games. She wasn't here to be their hero or their villain. She was here to shape their future, whether they wanted it or not. The gunshots and bloodshed had been necessary, but they were only the beginning. Power wasn't something you took once and held. It was something you built, brick by brick, decision by decision. And she was ready to build her empire. Behind her, the Black Coyote Saloon was just starting to come alive, the first of the day's patrons trickling in, already on edge. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what to make of Lil or her new reign. But that was exactly what she wanted. Fear was a powerful tool, but loyalty was the foundation on which she would build. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves approaching. She turned, her gaze narrowing as a familiar figure rode into town. Gus Hollister. His hat was low, his posture straight as always. There was no need for him to say anything. She could tell from his expression that something had changed. "What's going on?" Lil asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of authority. Gus dismounted, dusting his coat off, his eyes scanning the town before meeting hers. "There's word of something brewing just outside town," he said, his voice low, but urgent. "A group of men, headed this way. They've heard about you, about what you did to McGraw's men, and they're not coming to join your side." Lil didn't flinch. "How many?" 25, maybe more," Gus replied, his expression darkening. "A mix of outlaws, bounty hunters, and a few mercenaries looking to make a name for themselves. They're not here to negotiate. They want to take Deadwood Springs by force." Lil let out a slow breath, her eyes narrowing as she thought about her next move. The confrontation had been inevitable. She had known it from the moment she killed McGraw. His enemies, those who had aligned themselves with his criminal empire, were not going to let her take over without a fight. But that didn't matter. She wasn't running from anyone. She turned toward the saloon, where the men who had sworn loyalty to her were already gathering. It was time to make a decision, to show them just how far she was willing to go to keep control of the town. "Get the men together," Lil said, her voice firm. "We're not waiting for them to come to us. We'll meet them halfway." Gus's eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and approval. "You're not wasting any time, huh?" Lil's lips curled into a thin smile. "I don't have time to waste. They're coming for Deadwood Springs, and I'm not about to let them take it without a fight. I'll give them a taste of what happens when you mess with me." The town was already stirring as Lil's men gathered in the streets, weapons in hand, their faces set with determination. They had seen the bloodshed, felt the tension, and now they were ready for whatever came next. Some of them were seasoned fighters, others just men trying to survive. But all of them knew that under Lil's leadership, they had something to fight for. Gus joined her at the front of the group, his expression steely. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "This could turn into a bloodbath." Lil didn't hesitate. "I didn't come here to lose. If they want to fight, we'll show them what a fight really looks like." With a signal, she led her men out of town, heading toward the gathering storm of outsiders. The sun was now high in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty road ahead. As they rode, Lil's thoughts focused on the task at hand. She wasn't just defending her claim to the town. She was showing them all what it meant to challenge her. This was the final test, the one where she would either secure her future or be wiped from the map. As they approached the outskirts of town, Lil spotted them. Like shadows against the desert landscape, a dozen or more riders, their figures dark against the bright sky. They were spread out, as if expecting a larger battle, unsure of how many men Lil had brought with her. She wasn't about to let them underestimate her. "Prepare yourselves," Lil said, her voice calm, as the distance between them closed. "We hit hard and fast. We don't wait for them to make the first move." With that, they rode forward, closing the distance quickly. The first of the enemy riders saw them coming and raised his rifle, but before he could take a shot, Lil's men were already charging forward. The sound of hooves pounding the earth was deafening as the two groups collided. The battle was brutal, with shots ringing out in every direction. Lil's men were swift, trained, and deadly, but the enemy wasn't unprepared. The air was filled with the sounds of gunfire and shouts, dust rising up in thick clouds. Lil fought with the fury of someone who had everything to lose. She moved with purpose, taking down her enemies one by one, her revolver striking with precision. The enemy forces began to fall back, realizing too late that they had underestimated the woman they had come to challenge. Gus fought by her side, his rifle steady in his hands as he picked off enemies from a distance. But it was clear, Lil was the one who was driving this fight. She was the one pushing forward, never faltering, never hesitating. And soon, the few remaining men who hadn't fled were surrendering, their weapons dropped, their hands raised in defeat. Lil's men surrounded them, weapons drawn, making sure they wouldn't be able to retaliate. Gus walked toward her, his expression a mix of approval and respect. "You really did it," he said, his voice low. "You showed them who's in charge." Lil looked down at the defeated men, their faces bruised and battered from the fight. "I showed them what happens when they think they can take what's mine," she said quietly. "Deadwood Springs belongs to me, and anyone who doesn't understand that is welcome to leave." She turned back toward her men, who were now securing the prisoners. There was no celebration, no victory chants. There was only the quiet realization that the fight for Deadwood Springs had been won. But Lil knew this was far from over. The town was hers, for now. But as long as there were men willing to fight for power, she would have to keep proving herself. And Lil Byrne wasn't about to stop now. The sun had nearly set by the time Lil and her men returned to Deadwood Springs. The town had witnessed the battle from a distance, and now, as they rode back into the streets, it was clear that something had changed. The defeated men from the outskirts were held as prisoners, their heads bowed, their faces grim with the weight of their failure. Some of the townsfolk stood on their porches, peeking out through their windows, unsure of what to make of the sight. Of the woman who had just claimed her place as the undisputed ruler of Deadwood Springs. Lil led the way, her posture as proud as ever, her face unreadable. She had fought hard today, and now it was time to make sure everyone knew the truth. She wasn't just a killer. She wasn't just some outlaw who had taken advantage of a power vacuum. She was a leader, and Deadwood Springs would be stronger because of her. The men who had fought for her had seen it firsthand. They had followed her into the heat of battle, and they had seen how she commanded them. She wasn't just a woman in charge. She was a force to be reckoned with. And they knew now that there was no going back. As they entered the town, Lil dismounted, the soft thud of her boots hitting the ground echoing in the stillness. Gus stepped up beside her, his face hard and focused. The other men began to gather around, taking their places near the saloon. That was a clean win, Gus said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, but don't let it fool you. This town might be quiet for now, but sooner or later, there'll be someone else looking to take your place. And next time, they won't be as easy to deal with. Lil turned her eyes toward him, her expression unwavering. I've heard the stories before, Gus, she said softly, but with conviction. There's always someone waiting to take what isn't theirs. But I'm not afraid of them. I'll fight for this town, just like I fought today. And no one will take it from me. Gus nodded slowly, an unreadable expression crossing his face. We'll see. You're holding all the cards now, but it's gonna be a long game. Don't get too comfortable. Lil didn't respond, her gaze drifting to the men she had brought back with her. The prisoners were being held at the center of the street, bound and kneeling, waiting for her judgment. Some of them had been involved in the fight, others had simply been caught in the crossfire, but they were all there because they had come to Deadwood Springs with the intent to take it from her. That was enough. She walked toward them, her boots making no sound on the dusty street. The crowd had gathered around the edges, watching in silence. The weight of their gaze was not lost on her. They were waiting for her to make her decision, to show them that this town was hers, and no one would challenge her without facing the consequences. She stopped in front of the prisoners, her gaze cold, calculating. The men looked up at her, some defiant, others broken, but all of them were waiting for her to speak. You came here thinking you could take something from me, Lil said, her voice steady, piercing the silence. You came thinking I'd just step aside, that I'd be weak, just because I'm a woman. But look at you now. She gestured toward the men who had fought beside her, her loyal followers, standing strong behind her. These men are loyal to me, because they know that when you take something that isn't yours, there are consequences. One of the prisoners, a man with a weathered face and dark eyes, spoke up. You can't keep all of us down, lady, he sneered. There's always someone else, someone better than you, who's gonna come after you. You'll fall, just like McGraw did. Lil stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. I don't fall. Not like McGraw. And not like you. She turned to the rest of her men. Take them to the edge of town. Make sure they know what happens when they challenge me. Let them leave with their lives, but make it clear. Deadwood Springs belongs to me. And I'm not done building it. Her men moved quickly, taking the prisoners by the arms and escorting them toward the outskirts of town. There was no bloodshed today, not from her. She didn't need to kill them all. Their defeat was punishment enough. The message was clear. They would be allowed to live, but they would leave Deadwood Springs and never return. The crowd watched, some of them hesitant, others watching with a newfound respect. For the first time, they weren't sure who held the power, the old outlaws or the woman who had claimed it from them. When the men were gone, Lil turned back to the saloon. She could feel the eyes of the town on her, and for the first time, it felt different. There were no cheers, no crowds rallying behind her. But there was something else, something deeper. It was respect. The respect that comes from knowing that in this town, she would not bend. She didn't need anyone's approval. She didn't need their loyalty. She had something else, something more important. She had the power to decide who lived and who died. She had the strength to stand against anyone who came for her. And she had the vision to rebuild Deadwood Springs from the ground up. As she entered the saloon, the bartender had already prepared her drink, the amber liquid gleaming in the dim light. Here you go, the bartender said, his hands shaking slightly as he set it down. Lil took the glass, her fingers wrapped tightly around the cool surface. Thank you, she said, her voice soft but steady. Keep the rest of the drinks coming. We've got work to do. The door to the saloon swung open, and Gus entered, his gaze calculating, watching her closely. He knew, as well as she did, that this was far from over. But there was something different in the air now. Something had shifted. Deadwood Springs belonged to Lil Byrne, and everyone knew it. But in the West, nothing stayed certain for long. The night stretched on in Deadwood Springs, but the air felt different. The weight of the day's events was settling in, and for the first time since Lil had set foot in this town, it seemed as if the pieces were finally coming together. The street outside was quiet now, the sounds of the distant gunshots and the rattle of hooves having long since faded. The fire had been put out, the battle fought, but the war for control of this town, Lil's town, was far from over. Lil sat alone in the back corner of the Black Coyote Saloon, her eyes watching the dim glow of the oil lamps flicker. Her glass of whiskey was empty, but she didn't reach for another. Her mind was elsewhere, focused on the task ahead. The fight had been won, but there was still work to be done. Deadwood Springs had been claimed, but it needed to be built, restructured. She wasn't just a gunfighter anymore. She wasn't just a woman taking control of a town full of broken men. She was something more now. She was the future of Deadwood Springs, and everyone was watching to see if she could turn this barren desert into something stronger. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of boots approaching. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Gus Hollister had a way of moving silently, his presence always known just before he entered a room. "Thought I'd find you here," Gus said, settling across from her, his voice calm but with an edge of weariness. The battle had taken its toll on them both. "You knew I wouldn't be out celebrating," Lil replied, her voice steady but carrying the weight of her resolve. "There's more to be done." Gus studied her for a long moment, his gaze calculating, but there was no questioning in his eyes. He'd seen enough of her to know that this was just the beginning, not the end. "You did well today," he said, his voice finally breaking the silence. "You've shown them that you're not just some bandit looking to take a piece of the West. You've made a statement." Lil nodded, her fingers tapping lightly on the table as she considered his words. "I don't just want a piece, Gus. I want it all, and I'll take it. But the work's not done yet. There are more challenges ahead. More men waiting to see if I can hold this. They're not gonna give you time to breathe," Gus said with a nod, his face hardening. "There's always someone else out there, someone who thinks they can do it better. They'll see you as a threat, and they'll come for you, just like the others did." Lil's eyes narrowed as she listened to him. "Let them come. If they think they can take me down, they'll find out just how wrong they are." Gus chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "You've got the right attitude, but it's not just about guns and blood. It's about more than that now. You've got to win the people. You've got to make them believe that you're the one who can lead them, because they don't just follow strength. They follow conviction." Lil leaned back, absorbing his words. She had already proven herself in the eyes of many. She had taken McGraw's place, killed his men, and shown that she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. But now she had to show them something else. She had to prove that this was more than just a power grab. She had to build the town into something real, something people would want to fight for. "I've already started," Lil said, her voice firm. "The men are with me. They've seen what I can do. They know that I'm not going to back down, no matter what comes next." Gus nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "They'll follow you for that, Lil. But don't forget that you're playing a long game. And in this game, you don't just fight with guns. You fight with everything you've got." "I know," Lil replied quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this town stronger." Gus stood up, stretching his legs, and glanced over at the saloon's door. "I'll leave you to your thoughts. But remember, people are watching. Deadwood Springs is yours now, but the real fight is just beginning." Lil watched him leave, the door swinging behind him with a soft creak. She was alone again, but this time, she didn't feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. There would be challenges ahead, yes. There would be more men who wanted to take what she had, more people who doubted her ability to lead. But none of that mattered. She had already proven herself in the fight. Now, it was time to prove that she could be more than just a ruler. She could be a builder. The next day, Lil stood at the center of Deadwood Springs, looking out at the small, dusty town that was hers. The buildings were old and worn, the streets were uneven, and the air still carried the smell of gunpowder. But it was hers, and that was enough for now. She could feel the eyes of the people on her. They were watching, waiting to see what she would do next. They had seen the bloodshed. They had seen her take control. Now, they were waiting for her to show them what she could build. Lil moved through the streets with purpose, stopping occasionally to exchange a few words with the people who had decided to stay in Deadwood Springs. They weren't all convinced yet, but she wasn't going to force them to follow her. She would earn their trust, just as she had earned her place at the top. When she reached the edge of town, where the desert met the horizon, Lil stopped. She could see the mountains in the distance, the vast expanse of the west stretching out before her. There was so much more to do, so much more to conquer. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to chase after it. She had already taken what she needed. Now, it was time to make it last. Deadwood Springs is just the beginning, Lil murmured to herself, her voice steady, as she looked toward the future. The West was a wild place. It was a place of lawlessness, of bloodshed, of men and women fighting for what they could take. But Lil wasn't just another outlaw. She was something more. And Deadwood Springs would be the foundation on which she built her empire. The journey was far from over, but Lil Byrne wasn't afraid of what was to come. She was ready. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.